January 7, 1920. Dawn settles gently over the frost-covered fields of the Midwest. A faint line of pale gold stretches across the horizon, touching the roof of a weather-beaten barn and the long handle of a hand plow resting silently in the yard. A rooster breaks the quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn drifts across the frozen countryside, low and lonely, as if announcing the beginning of a new American era. Inside a small farmhouse, a coal stove hums softly, warming a kitchen lined with enamel pans, chipped mugs, and the smell of yesterday's bread. This is rural America at the start of the 1920s, untouched by the glamour of city lights, grounded in soil, sweat, and steady hands. And beneath the stillness, the lives of millions moved with a rhythm the rest of the country rarely saw or understood. Even as the roaring 20s began to take shape in American cities, rural towns remained deeply tied to habits that had hardly changed since the 1800s. Most families woke before sunrise, long before electric light could push back the darkness. In many counties, electricity had not yet arrived. The wiring poles often stopped miles before you reached the last farmhouse on the edge of town. More than half of all rural homes still relied on kerosene lamps, wood stoves, and water fetched by hand from a backyard pump or a nearby well. The nation's technological boom had begun, but it reached small-town America slowly, like a distant echo carried across open fields. And yet within those quiet landscapes, life was full, demanding, intimate, and bound by a sense of duty that shaped an entire generation. Farm life in the early 1920s revolved around the land. Families depended on it not only for income, but for their survival. A typical day began with the sound of boots against creaking floorboards, cold water splashed onto a sleepy face, and a hurried breakfast of biscuits, eggs, or whatever could be prepared quickly before the chores began. Cows needed milking. Chickens needed feed. Pigs needed tending. Horses, if a family owned any, waited for harnessing so they could pull the heavy equipment that kept the farm alive. Many farms did not use tractors yet. Gasoline-powered equipment was still too expensive, and credit was harder to secure in rural banks. For most families, the horse remained the backbone of labor, just as it had been for their grandparents. Schoolchildren had their own responsibilities, often rising early to help with chores before walking miles down dirt roads to small one-room schoolhouses. These buildings were often the heart of rural community life, places where children of all ages studied together under a single teacher who did more than teach. She maintained the wood stove, cleaned the classroom, and created a sense of hope for families who believed education was a pathway to a better future. Yet the lessons were simple. The focus remained on reading, arithmetic, penmanship, geography, and American history. Fancy subjects belonged to the cities. In the countryside, the basics were enough to build a life. Inside the home, daily routines were equally laborious. Cooking was time-consuming, often taking hours. A wood stove had to be fed, heated, adjusted, and monitored. Laundry days involved big iron pots, boiling water, starching linens, scrubbing dresses by hand, and hanging clothes on long lines stretched between barn posts. Women often spent entire days managing household tasks that modern Americans can finish in minutes. Without electricity, tasks required strength, coordination, and patience. And through it all, the sound of the radio had not yet filled American homes, not until later in the decade, when rural electrification slowly began to spread. Before that, evenings belonged to quiet conversation, the glow of kerosene lamps, and the creaking rhythm of rocking chairs on wooden floors. Despite the nation's economic boom in the 1920s, many rural families struggled financially. The end of World War brought dramatic changes in crop prices. Wheat, corn, and cotton had sold at high rates during the war, when European countries relied on American farms to supply food. Farmers borrowed heavily to expand their land and buy equipment, believing the high prices would last. But once the war ended, worldwide demand fell sharply, leaving thousands of farmers with heavy debts and shrinking profits. The prosperity shouted about in cities rarely reached the countryside. For rural America, the decade was quieter, harder, and often overshadowed by financial uncertainty. Still, the rural community spirit thrived. Neighbors relied on one another in tangible, life-sustaining ways. When a barn caught fire, the community rebuilt it. When a family fell sick, neighbors brought food. Weddings, funerals, harvest seasons, and summer picnics were shared events, often held on church grounds or inside the simple wooden halls that doubled as meeting places, dance halls, and social gathering points. The church remained the center of spiritual and social life, its bell marking time, its congregation forming the backbone of small-town support systems. Sermons echoed through the wooden rafters about duty, sacrifice, and faith, values that shaped the moral center of many rural families. Children in rural America grew up fast. Their chores were not symbolic but essential to the functioning of the household. A 12-year-old boy might handle livestock, chop wood, repair equipment, or help in the fields. A young girl, even at 8 or 9, helped her mother cook meals, can vegetables, sew clothing, and care for younger siblings. Childhood innocence existed, but it coexisted with responsibility. A boy learned to work the plow long before he learned to drive an automobile, and a girl often learned to manage a home long before she thought about a profession. Life required maturity early, but that maturity built resilience, a trait that defined rural Americans throughout the decade. Travel in rural America remained limited. Dirt roads were often narrow, rutted, and impassable after heavy rain. Automobiles were becoming more common, but many families still used horse-drawn wagons to reach town. Making a trip to town was an event planned ahead of time, sometimes saved for Saturdays when the general store buzzed with local families. Inside, the shelves held flour, sugar, coffee, molasses, nails, and dry goods, simple necessities that supported the rhythm of the countryside. Children wandered the aisles dreaming of penny candies, while adults exchanged local news or debated crop forecasts. Every town had its local characters, its politics, its sense of identity. Rural America had not yet been touched by national chains or uniform branding. Each store, each sign, each handmade product carried its own story. As the decade progressed, technology began to seep into rural life, slowly but unmistakably. The arrival of the radio was one of the first major changes. Families gathered around battery-powered sets long before they had electricity. News crackled through the speakers in uneven tones, blending local gossip with national stories. People heard baseball games, weather forecasts, presidential speeches, and music drifting across the airwaves. For many rural families, it was the first time they felt connected to the rest of the country in real time. Before radio, news might arrive days or weeks late, carried by traveling merchants or printed in local papers that circulated irregularly. But now, voices from New York, Chicago, and Washington entered small wooden farmhouses, changing the cultural landscape forever. Electricity followed, though its arrival was uneven. Some towns had power by the mid-1920s, others not until the 1930s. For those who did receive it early, the transformation was almost magical. Electric lights replaced smoky lamps, refrigerators replaced iceboxes, water pumps, washing machines, and irons began to ease the burden of daily chores. But not every family could afford these new appliances immediately. Some households lived in a strange blend of old and new, a single light bulb hanging from a cord in the kitchen, while the rest of the home remained lit by kerosene. The pace of change depended on money, geography, and the willingness to adopt unfamiliar devices. Still, even with these small advancements, rural America in the 1920s remained deeply traditional. The values were simple but not simplistic. Work hard, help your neighbors, respect the land, take care of your family, keep your word. These beliefs guided the rhythms of daily life, shaping the decisions that defined entire communities. Political debates were intense but often grounded in practicality, taxes, crop prices, roads, and education. Issues that directly impacted survival carried weight. National cultural battles felt distant, overshadowed by concerns rooted in the soil beneath their feet. Entertainment in rural areas was modest but meaningful. Community dances, church socials, barn concerts, traveling shows, and local baseball games brought families together. Many rural Americans still played their own music, fiddles, banjos, harmonicas, and guitars. Songs passed down through generations filled the night air during summer gatherings. Families sat on porches in the evening, sipping sweet tea, shelling peas, or simply talking under the wide American sky. In these calm, unhurried moments, rural America preserved the kind of quiet intimacy that still evokes nostalgia among older Americans today. Life was not without hardship. Medical care was limited. Doctors were few and often had to travel long distances to reach patients. A broken bone, infection, or illness carried real danger. Many rural families relied on home remedies, herbal treatments, and the wisdom passed down through mothers and grandmothers. Church communities organized to support the sick, but even then, survival often depended on resilience rather than medicine. Hospitals were far away, and transportation was slow. Every family had stories of loss, loved ones taken too early by conditions easily treatable today. The agricultural economy continued to shift through the decade. Mechanization slowly replaced manual labor, though many resisted the change. Credit was risky, banks could fail, crop prices could collapse without warning. And as the decade neared its end, rural America faced a storm it could not yet see coming, the Great Depression. The signs were already visible: declining farm prices, rising debt, increasing pressure on families to modernize while struggling to survive. These tensions defined the quiet undercurrent of rural life, setting the stage for the devastation of the 1930s. Yet despite these challenges, rural America in the 1920s possessed a deep sense of hope. Families believed in progress even if it came slowly. Churches preached perseverance. Schools taught patriotism and pride in American history. Farmers trusted their land, believing that good seasons would return. Children dreamed of futures shaped by opportunity, and communities held together through storms, droughts, and hardship. That unshakable spirit, the willingness to endure, to support one another, and to keep faith in tomorrow, remains one of the defining characteristics of rural American identity. As night falls over the countryside once more, the same farm fields stretch beneath a sky filled with stars brighter than any city lights. A lantern glows in a barn doorway. A dog lies curled beside the porch steps. The sound of crickets echoes through the warm summer air. It is the same land that shaped millions of American families, preserved traditions carried across generations, and defined a way of life both rugged and peaceful. And within that landscape, the story of rural America in the 1920s continues to resonate with a quiet dignity, one built from hard work, shared values, and the enduring strength of small communities that held this country together through some of its most uncertain years. This is what life truly felt like in rural America during the 1920s, not the glamour of the roaring cities, but the steady heartbeat of a nation grounded in its fields, farms, and families. A world of early mornings, long days, and peaceful evenings. A time when resilience was a necessity, community was a lifeline, and every sunrise promised the chance to build something that might last for generations.